Thank you very much. Without any right on time as well, which is great, fantastic for a conference. No overspill of time. I'd like to welcome anybody watching to the very casual, very conversational open source design, why open source needs designers for the future panel. I'm Errol Fox. I'm going to mostly be fielding questions from the audience. I believe that there is a Q&A section here in the Hop-In platform. If you haven't used it before, it should be on the right-hand side near the chat panel. Make sure you're in the session and not the event for asking Q&A and using the chat. And please pop your questions in the Q&A and I'll make sure that I keep an eye on the questions for our panelists. But we have some pre-prepared questions, and essentially we're going to have a conversation about this topic, about why open source or free and libre open source needs designers for the future. So I'm going to do very brief introductions of the panelists here, and then I'm going to ask them to spend a bit of time just talking about themselves, no pressure, talk about your history in open source, talk about how you got into it or what you do as a designer, and kind of give any background that you want to. So we have on the panel today Jan Dietrich. Hello, Jan. Good morning.
Hello.
We also have Bernard Tyers.
Your microphone is off or not?
I've been trying to press the unmute button. Hello, good morning, everybody.
And we have Natalie Rosenberg.
Hello, from France.
And we do have Abigail Makolo. I think that there might just be a couple of maybe connection issues, but we'll see what happens when Abigail comes back in. There we go. Hi, Abby.
Hi.
Hey. So we also no worries.
Yes.
No worries. Internet is internet. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't work well. So no worries. We're mostly glad to have you here in however connection allows us to. So I invited this group of people to talk about this subject for a couple of different reasons. We all come from slightly different kind of backgrounds within open source and design. Some of us have been doing it for longer, some of us have been doing it for fewer years, but we all have a love and an interest and a passion for the subject of design and open source and how those two coexist and work together. And we're also all interested in what the future of open source and design looks like. And we want to, I think it's a good idea to introduce that we are all somewhat connected through the open source design community. And if you want to find out more about the open source design community, you can go on the website, which is opensourcedesign.net. I'll just drop that in the chat just in case folks have not come across it before. But essentially, this is where a lot of us met and a lot of us continually talk about the different kinds of issues within open source and design. But if I can invite Jan to just tell us a little bit about himself before we launch into some of the questions. Take it away, Jan.
I've been involved, I think, in open source design, though not opensourcedesign.net, since about sort of 10 years off and on. Started lurking into some projects by Mozilla, which had a very good design outreach program at that time, and then sort of continued volunteering in a hackerspace at my university and so on. So and then since 5 years, I work for Wikimedia in Germany, the organization that provides the infrastructure for Wikipedia, and also a project named Wikidata, which is a sort of fact database connected to Wikipedia. That would be sort of my brief introduction in the open source sphere. Ariel, shall we just pass on to the next person?
Yeah, if you want to pass on to the next person, that would be great.
Then Bernard.
Hello. Okay, so let me see. My history in open source and design. Well, I guess I've been an open source software user for longer than I've been a designer in open source. From like the mid 90s, I was introduced to open source software, and I thought, what is this? How is this software made by people who more or less don't get paid for it? And the more and more I learned, the more I really liked the idea behind open source software. I'm not a software developer, so I was always on the outside of open source software, more so as a user. I never really saw ways of getting involved, because at that point you committed code or you don't do anything. I was an engineer, like a hardware and networks engineer. And then about 11, 12 years ago, I completely changed my career and studied HCI, so human-computer interaction. Don't ask me why, there's a long story there. But that was kind of my way into open source software as a contributor. Around that time, usability and easy to use was becoming more of a thing in open source software. It was becoming understood that it was necessary. And then, like Jan, I got involved with the starting of the open source design group, collective. I'm not exactly sure what we call ourselves. And
so we lost Bernard momentarily there. I know that to some extent Bernard has connection issues. We'll see when he comes back. But if somebody else wants to carry on in Natalie, if you want to go ahead, and then we'll see when Bernard and Abby come back. But okay. Internet connection is going to be a thing.
Never going to work. Hey, so I'm Natalie and I'm living in France. I know about open source software for about 10 years now. I'm a UX designer for 11 years, but I only mixed the two of them, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago. When some friend of mine who were working for Mozilla at the time asked me for help about regarding project they were working on, and what I found out at the time is that as they are software developers, they expect everyone to work like them, meaning pull requests and tickets and issues on GitHub, GitLab, whatever. But this is now how UX design works. It's like, it's not, okay, we made this project and at the end, could you make some small UX before we launch the project or whatever? We don't do UX at the end. It's not something that takes 2 weeks or 3 days. It is something all along the project. And with some friend of mine in France, we are wondering for a few years how we could involve UX designer inside a Floss project, because it's not really easy. When you want to get involved into a Floss project, you have a response like go read the documentation or PR welcome or stuff like that. This is not how it's working. Most of the time, our response is like, okay, it's not gonna do it. So I'm gonna walk away and leave it to someone else who maybe want to get involved in that. And I specialize in all the UX writing and all the content design, especially because when you create a digital project, whatever it is, digital product, website, mobile app, software, what is important is the content, because you're using them for the content, not for the beautiful, sparkling graphic design that's around. And I think someone asked me a question about the hashtag on Twitter, but I'm not on Twitter, so I cannot answer that question on the private channel.
Oh, I'll find out the answer to that. It's possible that there is indeed a DrupalCon Europe special hashtag that I think that you can also ask questions through as well. I'll keep an eye on that hashtag and see if we get any specific questions, but I think it's a wider conference hashtag as opposed to this specific session. I don't think we have a specific session hashtag that we've created. We're going to stay within Hopin. But if Bernard, you'd like to finish off anything that you were saying, if you if you want to, but if not, we can pass on to Abby.
No, I was coming to the end. Open source software design, good thing. Over to you, Abby.
All right. So I'm Abigail. I've been a UX designer for about 4 years now, but I only got to know about open source design just last year when I gave my very first talk with the Open Source Community Africa about how designers can be open sourcers, how designers can contribute to open source. And that's where I met Errol, and it's been great communicating about really how to push open source design forward. So since then, I have been advocating for open source design, trying to introduce the concepts to designers because so many of them, unbelievably, a lot of them do not know that you don't have to be a developer to contribute to open source. So it's still very new, and I've just tried to walk them through and show them how to make contributions. I also participated in the Outreach program last year, where I had a chance to make contributions to Mozilla's Firefox application for Android, and it was great just being in that community. I'm also a part of the open source design community, which I think is great, especially with the resources that they make available to designers and the job opportunities as well. So since 2020, I have had the opportunity to talk about open source design on FOSDEM, all things open, and here on DrupalCon. So I'm happy to be here. Right now, I'm working at Unity, which is an organization based in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm building a platform that connects unprivileged youth to resources near them, while also trying to push the open source design rationale on the side. So I think it's great to be here. It's great. Yeah.
It's great to have all of you here. I think one of the exciting and interesting things specifically about the design side of open source is the amount of new people that are coming into it, essentially. Like there are waves and waves of young designers, essentially, like young in terms of career, not young in terms of age, but also sometimes young in terms of age. But there's lots and lots of designers that are discovering open source as a different kind of way to participate in software. And I think that that's really personally really exciting. So it's great to have people that have been in the space for a while and people that are very new, so welcome. So I am just going to drop one of Abby's talks from FOSDEM in the chat as well. So everyone watching should have access to a talk done by one of the panelists each. If you want to go listen to them do and talk more about various different things to do with open source and design, you're more than welcome to post a talk. You can also hang out with us on the opensourcedesign.net community. We have a discourse forum there where we talk about lots of different things. I'm also trying to keep track of various different things that are sort of said and mentioned both in the chat and the Q&A. So there's a couple of things that have come up in the introductions already, and one of which is design terminology. And I just want to make sure that for folks listening that might not be as familiar with design terminology or design kind of functions or words, that we make sure that we cover any terminology that people might not be familiar with. So I think I heard UX being said. UX is a bit more of a more popular term nowadays. It means user experience kind of broadly. but also can be very varied within its within itself, essentially. So user experience can mean the experience that a user has across any point of a service sometimes. And then we can avoid any deeper terminology unless it comes up in the conversation, but there is always lots and lots of terminology within design, just as there is with any kind of function. We also heard mentioned Outreachy, just in case folks aren't aware of Outreachy. It's an internship fellowship program that is run primarily for anybody wanting to participate in an open source project, but with a specific focus on communities and people that are historically marginalized within technology and software. So Outreachy is a great program. We also had a comment about it being hard to attract new talent designers into open source projects, and maybe we'll get into that as one of our audience topics. But don't be afraid to post questions that you have for the panelists, but also if we say something that is you want further explanation on, like a term or a topic that we don't go into depth in, please let us know in the chat so that we can make sure that we cover it well for you all. I'm not going to go into my background, that's not important, it's all about the panelists today. So I don't think we can talk about the future of open source software and design until we talk about what it's like currently. So what I'd like to do is go around each of the panelists and ask them what do they think and how have they experienced design in the open source software space currently. And if you want to then cover any of the kind of myths or misconceptions or the way that design is kind of understood currently and is practiced currently. So we'll go, should we go in a different order? I think I might start with Bernard this time, if you're prepared.
I'm not prepared, but that's okay. So I think one of the biggest, maybe not misconceptions, but things that people expect is that open source software projects or developers aren't interested in design. I think it's more true to say that they might not know exactly what design is about. But that's not only true of open source software, that's also true of a lot of commercial software. I think their understanding of design, or what is common, is their understanding of design is about just the graphics layer, how the software looks, logos, colors, all of those very important aspects, but they don't see that design is also the design of the software. Like Natalie said earlier on, it's not about coming at the end of the project and sprinkling some UX on it. It's actually working throughout the software, how that software is going to work, the interactions, why the software is doing what it is, why the people who are using the software need to do a certain thing in a certain way. So that is, that's a big challenge. But I want to say with organizations like Open Source Design and other organizations and individual designers, contributing to open source projects, that will slowly but surely, be changed. Other misconceptions, I think. Oh gosh, I'll come back to that. I'll pass it over to. I'm going to pass it to Natalie.
Thanks. Yeah, that's true. I guess many in open source software, most of the time people using it and creating them are nerd people. So it's not pejorative, it's just they are nerds. So most of the time they are using command line interface. So what they usually say is that I don't need UX. But what they mean by UX is mostly the UI, so the interface with the graphic design. I remember one of the it was a spokesman of the La Quadrature du Net, which is a French lobby for internet rights. And he said one day during a conference, he said, on one hand, you have control and centralization like Google and Facebook, and on the other hand, you have freedom with command line interface. So it was mixing everything, meaning like if you have a graphic interface with buttons and everything, this is not floss. This is not freedom. You cannot have freedom with user interface, and it's completely. This is completely wrong. You can have useful interface on open source software, and the question you have to ask yourself is: do you want everyone to use your softwares, your open source software, or do you want to keep it yourself? I mean, okay, we're gonna stay between us, and not mingle with the common people. So this is one of I would say one of my interrogation about the open source software, because people are always wonder some of the open source people always say they're always whining, people are still using Windows. I don't understand why they're not using free software, because most of the time they are not useful. That's it.
So I'd like to go to Jan and then to Abby. So just a reminder of the question is, what is design in Floss like currently, and any misconceptions or any sort of misunderstandings that you have experienced or that you'd like to make a note of?
I think that open source, like design an open source project, still has a lot of the problems that we had like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There was a lot of literature in that time mentioning the problems, and I think they are still rather similar. The research sort of has gone away. It's not a cool topic anymore, but the problems are still around, that it's really hard for designers and developers to collaborate. It's often very different cultures. It's often very different tools. And there is sort of a mutual wondering about why doesn't it work? And that still is around. For me, a large positive development, I guess, was GitHub. I know that's also like a centralized thing, ran for profit by a company and so on. But what made it really nice is, I think, that it lowered the barriers of trying out being involved in open source projects. Once you had an account, you could, and you had a project there, you could, with relatively little, say, cost, write a bug report, look into other projects and see if they would interact with you, that project. And if they were nice, you could sort of continue doing that. And maybe at some point, ask them about design, or if you're a coder, contribute some code. And I think this is a really nice development that in some way, even though I'm not like structurally totally aligned with like having a big company running such an important infrastructure, it lowered a lot of the barriers of getting involved. And this is, I think, a very positive change for many people. Abigail, do you want to continue?
Yes, sure. Building on your point, Jan, I think from what I've seen, the ways of working, the design process is quite different from the development process. So it's just like he said, doesn't make collaboration very easy. But I have been privileged to work on projects where there is ongoing communication. You can see that from the GitHub threads. When a designer makes an idea and suggests an idea or gives feedback, the developer is able to understand their feedback most times, because maybe so having such systems in place where each side can understand each other actually fosters, design contribution in a very important way. Some myths, again, that I would say occur right now in the open source design, space is that designers have to learn the system or learn how to code before they can contribute to the project. But that isn't always necessary, because in the beginning it can even pose a barrier, if they have to maybe install, some very complicated tool that they don't know how to use. But it shouldn't be. Designers can actually contribute in ways that matter without, having that previous technical knowledge. So these are just some of the things that are opening up about, designers and how they can contribute in the open source space. And it's good to have these conversations around this topic.
So I'm going to move on to the next topic, and I'm actually going to come back to you, Abby, with the next question, which is about how FLOSS projects can make themselves more attractive and more ready for design contributions. But first, I wanted to thank you for moving into the future space, right? You described there a wonderful interaction that is the future of design and open source project collaboration, like being ready to receive design feedback, being open to it, being willing to bend and change the structure, the culture, even like drawing on some of what Jan was saying and things like that. So I think it's great that we're already talking about what can be done to improve design and open source for the future. So if you would like to continue, Abby, and then we'll go to each of the panelists as well, something else that you've experienced around how to make FLOSS projects or open source projects more attractive to designers, or how to get it ready for contribution better.
Okay, I think it helps if the project, especially the maintainers, are clear on what kind of help they need from designers. So I have been on project repos where I see, a small section that says designers or design help needed or something of that sort. And it just kind of, makes me feel like, okay, I can actually make an impact on this project. So being clear on what is needed, and even if the developers themselves do not know where design help is needed, just being willing to accept that help is very important. Like I was recently looking at a project on the open source design job board, and it was, hosted by a developer and everything. He didn't know exactly what help he wanted. He just knew that there was something wrong somewhere. And that made it possible for designers to be able to contribute in some way and say, okay, what if we did user research? What if we did usability testing? So just being willing to encourage that feedback. Also, it helps to have clear documentation of what the project is about, because that is the most daunting thing I have experienced myself, not knowing so much about the project, especially because I haven't used it before. I just want to make, some impact. So when I go on the project board or the project repo, I want to see information about the project and, what good it is causing. And then I can know how to contribute. So just these little things that, make it possible, especially for first time contributors, to know where to begin. That's important too. But I'll let the other panelists take the some other points.
So whoever wants to jump in, who's ready? Who's got?
Where I can talk about a French, sorry, it's in French again, a French initiative from a few UX designers here. So they create a website that can put in touch people in open source software that need help and people who want to help. So you're posting your project and you say, I need help, not only in UX design, but also in content, documentation, translation, maybe development. And if you are a helper, you can check the website and check all the projects ongoing and see what fits your skills, and give a hand.
What I would think is also an important point, and already several people in the panel mentioned that, it's like the differences in, let's say, pre-existing skills and in the tools that are tied to that. And design being a different discipline and having a different history than development and coding, speaking very generally, also says that there are different cultures and different ways to approach problems. And I think it helps greatly to have a look at that and sort of see where you could lower barriers. Yeah, a typical thing, I think, Natalie, you mentioned it, or Abby, I'm not sure, is the idea that, yeah, just write us some code, just do a pull request and so on. But most designers will have no experience with that. Their strong skills are somewhere else. So how do you get that skills in your projects? I think a strong improvement for me was already when most issue trackers started to allow pasting images there. That was a big thing before everything was text. And then you could, paste a sketch. And that was huge. And going in that direction is really helpful. Some designers might rather prefer using something like Nextcloud or so. I know, I'm not saying that, abandon Git, but Git is made for Linux kernel developers by Linux kernel developers. So it's unsurprising that it might not be the ideal tool for design collaboration.
Yeah, there used to be a tool, I can't even remember its name now, but it was essentially a version control system for images, for screenshots, for wireframes. I can't remember what it was called. And it was essentially, it was Git, but for, let's say, images. And it was bought by, I don't know, Dropbox, and then it was killed, which was very unhelpful. So like Jan said, like Jan said, Git was built by Linux kernel developers who more or less work in the text world or the text-based world, and visual people or people who work in the visual space weren't ever thought about. And I think, at the risk of sort of making excuses, I think that was okay at the time because it was built for a particular use case. However, 99% of software is not Linux kernels, is not software that is never seen by humans, and that coming together of software for people who work in different ways, I've got to absolutely agree. How can projects make themselves more available and more attractive? I would actually come at it from the other point of view. So I only contribute to software projects that I myself use or I have some interest in. And this is a little bit of the original kind of philosophy of open source software. You build it for yourself, and if other people find it interesting or useful, great, then that's okay. My reason for doing that is because my sort of philosophy on design contributions to open source is you need to do a lot of upfront research about the software. If I'm going to contribute to software and I know nothing about it, like Abigail said, I've never used it before. I don't know how it works. I don't even know why I want to use it. That's a really difficult thing to do because, well, for the very obvious reasons. So if I'm using the software, even if it's a small plugin for something, I know how I know how I interpret it as working. I know what I expected to use, almost as, you know, the designer as the user, which we're always told, you know, you're not the user. But that gives me a sort of a hook into, okay, well, I know I'm not the user, so I need to go and find actual users or other users and take their points of view into account. Is it the right way? I'm not sure, but it certainly makes that onboarding experience much easier because I know what it's supposed to do. And anytime I sort of advise or talk with designers who are interested in contributing to open source software, my first thing I say is find open source software that you use or that you would use, and contribute there, because your language, your understanding is, you know, much more broad and much more vast than if you came to something completely new. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of really great questions, but I think one of the thing from what you were saying, Bernard, that I don't think a lot of people realize is it's incredibly likely that there is a designer of sorts that is using your open source software in some way. And I think that the first thing to get familiar with is the idea that people like designers, like documentation writers that work on content, that work on like usability, are probably either interested in and tried to use your software. Tried is like maybe the word to use here, and maybe successfully used it. But I think that you'd be surprised at how many designers are likely looking at your open source software projects and wanting to use the tool and wanting to get involved. And really, what Abby was saying, what we're all saying, really is that one of the best things that you can do is make it welcoming and meet the designers where they are as well. And I think that often that's quite simple, and it's often having a conversation in some way outside of some of the typical, again, I'm using sort of like a generalized term, the typical kind of communication channels that a lot of coders or developers use, which is, you know, often sort of pull request comments, issues, trackers. And maybe if you're lucky, there's some kind of comms channel using some kind of platform, Matrix or Discord or Slack or whatever is ended up being used. But having a place where you can communicate is really, really great. So we've got a couple of questions, and we're also running up on time. This is always the trouble with a panel, is like there's so much to cover. We can never cover all the interesting things that are about this topic. And I think one of the things that I also just want to mention is that a lot of us here on the panel are very like user-centered designers. So that's whether it's coming from a content perspective. Let me know, folks, if you on the panel, if you don't describe in this way. But I think one of the perspectives we don't have here is necessarily a designer which is maybe very UI design systems, graphic design kind of focus, which doesn't mean that they aren't user focused. It just means that there is a slightly different pathway that they might have into contributing into an open source project. It might be more, it's a different kind of pathway that they would interact with users potentially. So apologies for not having kind of that perspective, but there's tons of them out there, designers that want to focus on those kinds of things. But from the questions we've got, what is the most discouraging thing when trying to contribute? And then there's a few suggestions in the question, which I won't mention unless they are mentioned. But you know, panelists, you can check them out. But shall we go to? We'll go to Natalie first, if that's okay. Yeah. What's the most discouraging?
Yeah, like I said earlier, tech people have a way of working on an open source project, and it's usually issues, tickets, pull requests, and they expect everyone to work like them, but we are not working like them. So most of the time when we are coming on a open source project, so they say I've read the documentation, check the issues, and make some. So, but we don't work in the issue ways. We have a broader vision. Most of the time, my main parallel is imagine you are building a house. You're not an architect, but you are building a house, and just like you're about to finish your house, you ask an architect to come and check the house. and you expect the architect to just say, okay, just add a window here or paint the room in white instead of red. But it's not like that. Maybe the architect will have to say, maybe you have to tear your house down because it's really, really badly made. You know, you put the you put the stairs outside the house. It's completely useful. Your bathroom is in the middle of the kitchen. It's completely useless. So this kind of stuff. So that's gonna end. So this is it. We are definitely not working the same way. And when we want to work with an open source project, we first have to explain what is UX design and how we are working. And no, we are not just going to put some sparkling, shiny, brilliant images on the interface. Not like that.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to move to Abby first to answer what's the most discouraging thing that you've experienced and then quickly on to Bernard and then Jan, and then we'll close up.
Okay, for me, it's when the documentation is quite technical, it uses a lot of tech jargon, and I cannot understand it. It just makes it difficult to know where to even begin. And what makes it worse is when maybe there isn't quick response from a maintainer, and then you're just stuck. Like you want to help, but you don't know where to go next. So that for me has been the most discouraging thing.
I think for me, it is just a downright, we don't need design contributions. You can deal with that. More difficult is when there's a making a decision. So, I've done a bunch of research. Here are the design improvements. How should it, here's what we think should happen. Without somebody that's going to contribute the code, your design goes nowhere. So a lack of that, decision making. Okay, here's what we're going to do based on the design. That I think is probably the most discouraging thing. Even if it's the wrong thing, if it's done, something has been done, and we can see if it's good or if it's bad. Yeah.
Yeah, adding to that, I think that would be a very important thing also for me. Being clear what you like, which changes you can do, which resources you have for whatever the designer you want to work on that will provide. Like if you can do a full overhaul and you like to be told to buy or at least collaborating with a designer what all to change, like, yeah, that's great. But if you only have the possibility to change some words on the interface, straightforwardly say that this is the maximum you can currently do, it makes it a lot more easy, because otherwise there are sort of false hopes on both sides, and the difficulties will continue, instead of a designer maybe saying like, yeah, okay, if it's just like some wording changes, here are my top 3 wording changes, and you can push them on the same evening. Great.
Look at that, right on time. We've only got a minute left. So thank you so much for starting. Essentially, we've started this conversation about open source design, designers' place in open source, and the future of it. But there's tons more conversations to be had. Please join us in open source design in the forum, on our monthly community calls. Our monthly community calls are very welcoming, I think, anyway, very welcoming of everyone, from like people just getting interested in design to people that are maintainers on open source projects. There are a few social channels and links in the chat if you want to follow any of the panelists. And yeah, please ask designers more questions and engage with more designers around open source. And thank you very much.